this is my title today. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about mathematics, a little bit about economics, and a little bit about history. And if the history lapses a little bit into personal reminiscence, I'm the oldest person in the room, so I hope you'll excuse me a little bit. So to start with history, I want to introduce those of you who don't know him to this man, Ralston-Paterson. Is he well known here? Not really. Well, Ralston-Paterson, I think, is one of the giants of the history of radiotherapy. He was the director of the Christie Hospital in Manchester. Already this morning we've heard several mentions of the Manchester technique in the use of cervical brachytherapy. The Manchester technique was described by Paterson and Parker, the Manchester system, way back when originally, I think in the 1940s. I would say that Paterson could be the father of modern hypofractionation, and I'll show you why. Paterson began exploring hypofractionation in the 1940s. He took his job as head of the Christie after touring the world, seeing what the rest of the world were doing, and most people at that time, there'd been a previous debate about fractionation. Most of the world were using 5-6 week courses. Paterson started to use shorter courses in Manchester at the time of the war, in response to shortage of resources. Okay? So I think already we can see what resonates between what Manchester was doing then and the needs of the developing world. Manchester, for those of you who don't know it, is the main industrial city of the north of England. It has a large catchment population. The Christie was the only radiotherapy centre for a large, rather impoverished, very working class area. It's the town about which Friedrich Engels wrote The Conditions of the Working Class in England in 1848, which described pretty horrible conditions historically. So what Paterson found in Manchester, although of course it was still, his resources were still munificent compared with what's available in most of Africa now, but nevertheless he perceived that he was overwhelmed with work and had too few resources to cope with the demand. So he started reducing the number of fractions from 30 to 25, and eventually started treating almost everything with 15 fractions. And as a grid scientist, he wrote up his work and audited it, and he developed a very, very good system of postal follow-up for patients, which meant that the Christie was able to really show that they were getting acceptable results. And just as well as designing the Manchester system of brachytherapy, as well as I say, being the father of modern hypofractionation, Paterson has got another extraordinary claim to fame in that he originated the very first 2 randomized clinical trials in the whole of oncology. There were no medical oncologists in that time, of course, but Paterson started 2 trials in the 1947 and 48, I believe, which finally got written up in 1962. These were in breast cancer, so they're not they weren't the radiotherapy was hypofractionated, but they weren't trials specifically of hypofractionation. So Paterson described 15 fractions as the standard for nearly everything that was done at the Christie at the time. He wrote it up in what was in England the standard radiotherapy textbook, which was published in 2 editions, one in the 40s, one in the 60s, and then updated a little bit in the 70s. This was the 2nd edition, published in 62, just after Paterson retired. He retired from radiotherapy to become a sheep farmer in the Scottish Lowlands. And here's an example of the sort of treatment that Paterson was describing. This is for a lateral oropharyngeal lesion. Now this as you may, I'm going to magnify a little bit of this, but essentially this was a treatment still using kilovoltage radiation, although the essences of it were transferred to megavoltage quite readily. You can see that it was done with beam direction, not specifically isocentric technique, beam directions, small beams converging with accurate positioning and with tissue compensation, which in the era of megavoltage became removed from the skin and put further back in the beam, but tissue compensation so that you had a beam that was perpendicular to the surface of incidence. So this is the sort of treatment that when I was learning radiotherapy initially in the late 1970s, this is the sort of thing that was, although the masks and so on were a little bit more modern looking, this was the sort of thing that was being widely used. But what I want particularly to draw your attention to is this. Sorry, I'm jumping ahead. By comparison, this is from Fletcher's textbook, written a little bit later. This is the sort of fields that Fletcher was using to treat. And this was what became more or less the international standard, I think we can say, during that era. Much, much wider fields. But what I want to draw attention to about Patterson is this bit down here, which we'll blow up. Patterson, for nearly everything, was giving a 3-week schedule, and for this particular lesion, he would have done 5,000 rads, which perhaps many of you won't even know what a rad was. The rad was the old unit that is now transcribed to 50, that's 50 Gray. 1 rad was a centigrade. So 50 Gray in 15 fractions. So that's the Manchester School of Hypofractionation, which was widely spread around the northern part of the United Kingdom, and I think we can say that the Canadian school, that also traditionally used quite a lot of hypofractionation, took that inspiration from the Christian, from Manchester. So let's talk a little bit then about what are the theoretical considerations if we're talking about hypofractionation. Well, for a start, obviously, the total dose tends to be lower. And that, of course, is why the larger dose per fraction doesn't cause, as Dr. Munn said, doesn't cause the breast to fall off. The larger fractions, if you gave the same total dose, would be very damaging. But with hypofractionation, you give a smaller total dose. An interesting thing, though, is that, of course, if you give hypofractionation, you do it daily, you inevitably end up with a certain reduction in the overall time. So hypofractionation intrinsically entails a degree of acceleration. And the other thing to note is that in some cases, the treatment volume that was identified, in those days of Patterson's book, we didn't use terms like clinical target volume, planning target volume, but the concept was pretty similar. The irradiated, the main volume that received the high dose tended to be smaller in these schedules. That perhaps resonates with some modern treatments as well, does it? As I said, if you're going to give daily larger fractions to a rather smaller total dose, which is what most hypofractionated schedules do, you inevitably get a degree of acceleration, which is important particularly important in some areas. We'll come to that in a minute. If you accelerate your dose to things like the oral mucosa, you will get problems with acute reactions. So the implementation of hypofractionated schedules may be a little bit problematic in things like the head and neck, and indeed there have been far fewer studies of hypofractionation in head and neck by and large. On the other hand, where late effects predominate, the tissue is not proliferating during the time of radiotherapy, so in theory you wouldn't expect the overall time to be important. So for disease sites like breast and prostate, where what we're worried about are late effects on normal tissues rather than the acute reactions in most cases, that's where hypofractionation has hitherto really come into its own in terms of clinical trials and successful rates. if we're looking at late effects, we can, as I say, by and large, not pay a great deal of attention to the overall time, because the tissue is not proliferating as long as there's sufficient interfraction interval. Then it becomes quite useful in assessing your hypofractionated regime to calculate its biologically equivalent dose. We've already seen this referred to a few times in other. So I'm not going to go into the mathematics of it. I'll just do a little bit of self-publicizing here, if I may, and say that for those interested in how the formula is derived, a group of us tried to write a paper that made the mathematics accessible to clinicians. That's no mean feat, if we succeeded. But it has been widely quoted. So this is the formula by which BED of a schedule can be calculated. D being the total dose, little d being the dose per fraction, and of course alpha beta, the alpha beta ratio we all know about. Now the interesting thing is that, of course, d and little d are measured absolutely precisely. We know to very tight precision what the dose and dose per fraction are. That's what our physicists tell us all the time. Alpha and beta, though, the alpha beta ratio remains a slightly intangible quantity. One reason probably being that it's probably not the same from one individual tumour to the next. But to the best of my knowledge, no one has ever really very successfully measured individual alpha-beta ratios. They've always been derived from population studies done by such people as David Brenner and Eric Hall at the Columbia. So alpha-beta, we have approximations for. We're never quite sure. We do these calculations. There's always a degree of uncertainty. Then if we were to try and extend these into looking at the overall time of treatment, we would of course have to allow a time factor, because tumours repopulate. Not all normal tissues are repopulating at a rapid rate. The mucosa, of course, is, but the soft tissue of the breast and, is probably not. So if we want to study tissues that are proliferating more rapidly, we need to consider the overall time and include a time constant, a repopulation constant to allow for the overall time. And in fact, these repopulation constants are really very, very difficult to give precisely. After many, many thousands of patients have been studied in fractionation studies in head and neck cancer, people have come to the conclusion that you essentially have to allow 0.9 gray per day for any prolongation. But for other tumour sites, it's not really very clear what repopulation constant is for that site. So it's not very easy to use this formula when we're looking at rapidly proliferating tumours or rapidly repopulating normal tissues like mucosa or bone marrow even. So for late reacting tissues, generally the alpha beta is low. Now that means that the changes in fraction size will have a significant impact upon the effect of the schedule. And these tissues tend to only have a relatively low rate of repopulation, so our BED calculations will at least give us an idea in advance of how successful a schedule is likely to be. For acute reacting tissues, the alpha beta tends to be high, so actually it's the total dose rather than the way you fractionate it that matters. But rapid repopulation means that your BED calculation, unless you give the treatment over the same time, is not going to be very good. Of course, tissues are different in their rate of their rate of population and have variable alpha betas. It's fairly clear that head and neck cancers and probably cervix cancers have a high alpha beta, but increasingly it's become evident that tumours like breast and prostate, taken as a population, not necessarily for every individual patient, but as a population, breast and prostate cancers really have quite low alpha beta ratios. And don't forget, it's low alpha beta ratios. You can use the BED to work out how your schedule will look. Of course, tumours are always repopulating. That's what makes them tumours, whether rapidly or slowly. So we can be sure that if there is a prolongation of treatment, whatever the tumour, prolongation of treatment cannot be good. So PED as a mathematical tool has been good for tumours where late effects are the problem, breast, prostate, not so good for head and neck. Here's an example of how BED calculations have led to experiments in prostate hypofractionation. And if you assume the prostate tumour has an alpha beta of 1.8, a schedule of 62 Gray in fractions of 3.1 will have the same BED as one of 80 Gray in 2 Gray fractions. So look, that's 3/4. So you saved a quarter already. So having seen the theoretical benefits, the practical benefits are really fairly self-evident. It's better for health service providers and it's better for the patient. It reduces for the patient not just time and travel, it reduces what's called financial toxicity. I won't talk about this. There's a very good young medical oncologist from Nepal called Bishal Gayawali who writes a lot in social media and electronic media, writes about financial toxicity. I commend his writings to everybody. So with hypofractionation, we now have, as has already been mentioned, we have very high level evidence that it's safe to hypofractionate for breast treatments. I think we can say the same for prostate. So at long last, the predictions of radiobiology have come to be useful in clinical practice. I'm not sure it's not the first time. But I would say we have to take a note of caution that if the acceleration of treatment, the acceleration of treatment that is inevitable could have problems with acute effects if there are some other things that might affect acute reacting tissues. By and large, with breast and prostate, we're concerned with late reacting tissues. But acute GI toxicity could be a problem, particularly with prostate. And if you give an intercurrent drug that might enhance toxicity in the bowel, you might just run into problems if you hypofractionate. There have been anecdotal stories of this sort of thing. And of course, I can't pass on the high-level evidence without mentioning that we now have very, very convincing evidence that for nearly all cases of bone metastases, a single fraction is as good palliation as any more prolonged schedule. The way forward, well, we've heard a lot about stereotactic treatments that are coming along. For the breast and the prostate, people are looking at ultra hypofractionation. There are randomized trials already underway in the UK. One thing to say about the very small volume treatments the very hypofractionated treatments is that if we can reduce the normal tissue volume, we can then ignore the late effects in many tissues, but not in all. So if we reduce the volume of normal lung that's treated, we can give as high a dose almost as we want. If we were to impinge on the spinal cord, that would be a disaster. Serial reacting tissues are very susceptible to high doses. Parallel tissues, you can get away with almost eradicating a little rim of normal tissue. And that of course is the essence of what's been happening with stereotactic treatments. So we can now give small volumes because we have very precise beam positioning. Although in a way, that's stereotactic treatment, in a way it's not so different from what Patterson was doing 50 plus years ago. One thing about the smaller volumes that are used today, we do have two huge benefits. We've got very, very much better imaging, so we know precisely where we're aiming our small beams. And I suggest that effective systemic therapy helps control some of the tumour around the margin, so the small volumes are perhaps safer to give than they were in older days. So nearly at the end now, I'll just give you, I'm not a religious man, but here's a quote from the Bible. Nothing is new under the sun. And I'll just stray from hypofractionation. I think it gives a little clue to other aspects of radiotherapy. Bad radiotherapy is worse than no radiotherapy, I would say. But simple radiotherapy can be good radiotherapy. It's not to say complex radiotherapy isn't better, but you can give good radiotherapy with simple techniques in many occasions. Asante sana.